We're going to get started. There are no assigned seats, are there? So that means I won't take a seat either. I'm Elliot Gerson, Executive Vice President of the Aspen Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We just lost Walter. We had Walter, and he may come back for a second. Got to get a quick beverage. He'll come back, but as I will explain, we tend to do about 12 things at once during the summer here at Aspen, and Walter's moderated 4 things today and has to go off to something else. But let me start by just welcoming all of you to Aspen. My understanding is that perhaps half, if not 2/3 of you have not been to this summit before. And perhaps haven't been to Aspen or haven't been to the Aspen Institute before. Others I recognize. I think this is the 4th summit we've had like this, and it's very exciting to see some of the people who've been here from the beginning and also lots of new people. Sadly, the issue that we're looking at does not get any easier each year. Frankly, it just gets more urgent. In a few minutes, we're going to have a panel discussion. We'll talk more about the themes of the summit. But I thought before that, because so many of you are new to Aspen, I might just say a little bit about the Aspen Institute. I could tell just from talking to some of you out over drinks that you don't quite understand what the Aspen Institute is. And it's not an easy place to understand. We were founded here in late 1949, meaning here in Aspen. At that time, there wasn't much to Aspen. Essentially, it was a silver mining town that had been going downhill since the 1890s. And our founder, Walter Pepke, who was a Chicago industrialist, recognized the extraordinary beauty of this town. Obviously, actually, his wife had discovered that during the war and told him about it. He came back to Aspen and saw the potential as a businessman and as a very committed civic booster of post-war America. He started everything from the ski company to the music festival to other things that still continue today. But the reason he started the Aspen Institute is he wanted there to be a place to bring his colleagues, his cohorts from American business, and that time was largely older white males, to somewhere where they could reflect seriously on some of the most important issues of the day. So it was also founded during a time, obviously, both post-war but also Cold War. So part of his motivation was to really educate business leaders about the foundations of really Western democracy and capitalism, and so they could understand the underpinnings of democracy better. And he wanted them to come together and to come to programs here and then go back to their, not just their businesses, but their communities and try to make them better, whether it's through governance or through the values through which they operated. In the years since then, we have grown tremendously. We do many, many different things, which make it hard to explain in a short period of time what we do. We're now headquartered in Washington, but we still use Aspen as essentially our summer campus, and from the middle of June to the middle of August, we have convenings here, very much like this one. Extraordinarily talented people, leaders in their field, invited here together to grapple with critical issues. You are gonna be sharing this campus with people who are focusing on energy and environment issues and also education reform issues. And we've just finished sessions here looking at the future of technology. And last week we finished the Aspen Ideas Festival, where we looked at a great range of issues. One of which ran throughout the entire Aspen Institute, was what essentially wither the American dream. What has happened to the American dream? Looking at inequality, looking at opportunity, and asking questions about what can be done. And so in many respects, this summit picks up on key themes that are very important to the Institute. The Institute today, just flashing forward, there are more than 300 people. Most of the Institute's personnel work in the public policy area. The program sponsoring this that Ida Rademacher heads is one of about 30 policy programs. They range across almost all aspects of domestic policy and also foreign policy. If there is a critical mass of programs that look at similar kinds of issues, they probably relate to the challenges of domestic poverty and opportunity. Indeed, Maureen Conway, who's here as well, runs our our economic opportunity program, and there are 4 or 5 other programs that some of you are already familiar with that also grapple with similar kinds of issues. So much of what the Institute does, it relates to the policy work and things just like this. We also do increasingly public programs, and this really fulfills our public education aim to inform the public about critical issues. And that way we open our doors to sessions like this, but not just to experts, but to anyone. The Aspen Ideas Festival, which I mentioned, is probably the prime example of that, but we do countless other programs of a public educational nature, either here in Aspen in the summer, in Washington throughout the year, in New York and San Francisco and other cities as well. The third leg of the stool are our seminars. And those, you may also overlap this week with people coming here to engage around a seminar table in discussions about values, about timeless values of leadership, the definition of what a good society is. And if any of you have, I don't know if any of you have taken that seminar before, but I would urge you to consider that. We also do seminars targeted to younger people that are topical, led by expert moderators, and that's something else for those of you who are intrigued by Aspen and might like to come back and do something else, could consider doing something like that. Finally, we have young leaders programs. And those programs involve extraordinary young people whom we select now from all over the world. Some that are domestic, but we also have them in many other countries, and we also invite people from other countries to our domestic program. Those are 2-year programs of people primarily from the private sector, early in their careers, who've already achieved significant success in their careers, but are at a point in their career where they're asking questions about what else can I do, not just in my own career, but to make a difference in my community, whether it's my city, my state, my country, or the like. And those programs have, and they're now, and I think we have fellows from more than 100 countries around the world. Finally, one last aspect of what we do is that we export the kind of spirit and purpose of what we do to other countries. And there are now 9 other countries that have their own Aspen Institutes. Most recently, we launched an Aspen Institute in Mexico. We have them in Europe, we have them in Asia, and now in Latin America. And they do very similar kinds of things, bringing people together around policy issues like this, but also performing important functions in public education, and also to inspire the young people in their country to get involved in attacking some of the most critical issues in those countries. So that's what we do. We have this wonderful campus that we hope you'll enjoy. Most of the times we bring people here. I don't know how hard Ida's working, all of you. I hear you starting about 8 in the morning, but we like to hope that you'll have time to wander around, maybe take a hike and do some other things as well. One of the magical things about this campus that we're lucky enough to have is that it really induces the kinds of conversations outside of the sessions that you're going to have that can really make a tremendous difference. So that's, as you can see, we probably don't have a 30-second description of what the Aspen Institute is, but that gives you a general sense of the range of things we do, and this fits really very, very nicely into that. So for those of you here for the first time, we hope it will not be the last time, and I know it's going to be a very productive few days. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ida. And let me just also say how thrilled we are with Ida's leadership. Many of you were familiar with this program that was designed by Lisa Mensa. Lisa Mensa did an extraordinary job and, of course, was recognized by the president and appointed to an important position in the Department of Agriculture, looking particularly at issues relating to rural development and rural poverty. And so we had an opportunity to go out and find someone who could take what Lisa had built and bring it to the next level. And we were very thrilled to find Ida. Ida?
remarks, let me go ahead and ask the panel to come up and get mic'd up, and I'll be introducing them as we start, because I'm going to keep it quick. Thank you so much, Elliot, who I'll be introducing in a moment in a little bit wider thing. And welcome to everybody. It's strange standing up here. We won't do this for the rest of the summit. We'll all be in one big group, but tonight calls for a special celebration. So thanks for getting to Aspen. I know for some of you that was no small feat today, so I appreciate it. I promise you it will be worth it. Being here to help me kick off my first financial security summit, but to help Aspen kick off the fourth it's just, I wouldn't be anyplace else right now. I know a lot of you in this room really well from my former life, and there's a lot of you I've gotten to know in the 6 months that I've started working in this program. I know that over the next couple of days we're going to change all of that, and everybody here will know each other quite well. It's an intimate group. It's a beautiful setting to have the kind of conversations we don't get to have when we don't really get to check our day jobs 2,000 miles away and come to a beautiful setting like Aspen. So I'd say we don't have humidity and we don't have bugs. We still have thunderstorms, but we'll see if we can figure out that.
We have bears.
We have some bears. I saw one on the bike path. But he was friendly. He went right away. Don't worry about that at all. Look, our topic of dialogue, and I'll just say this really quickly, is so much in the headlines these days, it's on the verge of becoming cliche. Inequality, the disparities we see in wealth and in income, the level of financial insecurity that we know so many millions are facing. It's what President Obama said last year, and it's what Walter Isaacson said at this summit last year as well, that this is the defining issue of our time. And so we will be engaged in conversations ideally over the next 2 days that are rare, but that go way beyond talking about the problem to really getting into ideas about solutions, really core solutions to some of the drivers of wealth and income inequality in this country in ways that are reflective, in ways that are challenging, in ways that are thoughtful, in ways that will hopefully be catalysts for new things going forward coming out of this. So this is the forum to do that. This is the place. It's a casual but incredibly serious opportunity for all of us, and I can't think of a group I would rather kick this off with than you all, so thank you for that. And speaking of kicking off, I'm going to kick off the panel, and we've got a wonderful panel here tonight. So just quickly, I'll turn this over to Elliot to moderate for us, and I think Elliot introduced the Institute very well. He didn't introduce himself incredibly well. He is not only my boss, but the boss of the other 30-some policy program directors at Aspen, all of the public programs, including the Aspen Ideas Festival, and runs all of the relationships with those 9 international affiliates that we have. He also manages to be very involved in the Rhodes Scholarship Program and was a Rhodes Scholar himself prior to escaping the law, as it were. He clerked for the Supreme Court, was Attorney General Deputy in Connecticut, and has grappled a lot with, when we talked about some of the disparity and poverty alleviation programs at Aspen, has done a lot to connect the dots between those and worked really as a tireless champion behind the scenes to make sure that we're having the kind of conversations that can be meaningful and transformative at Aspen. So thank you, Walter. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Elliot, for doing that. I told you, they said they were transformative.
Oh, we were classmates, so
it's true, but that's where the similarities end. So, and I'm just going to go down to introduce and just quickly introduce all of you. You'll have time. You have their bios, but just briefly, welcome, Jean. Senator Tom Harkin, far over to the left, is the 5-term senator from the great state of Iowa from 1985 to 2015, and retired just in January of this year. He also served 10 years in the House of Representatives. His legacy, there's a few different dimensions that I think he would very much want you all to know about, and by the end of this evening, you'll know about them whether I tell you about them or not, in a great way. But his particular work on the Americans with Disabilities Act and his tireless efforts really to bolster Social Security and to strengthen private savings, and really understand that as the problem that it is in this country. His work culminated with the USA Retirement Fund's proposal last year, and we'll be picking up threads of that all through this conversation, so thank you for being here with us. Sarah Wartell, right in the middle, is appointed recently, just a couple of years ago now, as the 3rd president of the Urban Institute. and really has put it's been fascinating to watch. I think you all have joined me in that, and putting an entire new strategy and communications engine into that esteemed think tank. It's been a wonderful transformation to watch. She also co-founded the Center for American Progress and was part of the executive team there, running policy, the fellowships, communications, and also had a lot of important work that she did in the Clinton administration as Deputy Director for the National Economic Council as advisor to the President on economic policy. I don't know anybody with greater knowledge of housing markets, greater passion for supporting and promoting evidence-based policy than Sarah. So again, thank you for making the trip. Thank you for joining us. And Lily, if I were introducing you a month ago, I would introduce you as the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. If I were introducing you a year ago, I would have introduced you as the Majority Chief Tax Counsel for the U.S. Committee on Finance in the Senate. And today, it's my pleasure to introduce you back in your academic position as a Professor of Law and Public Policy at the NYU School of Law and also an affiliated professor at the Wagner School. And Jonathan Murdoch is also there. Is Jonathan here yet? So I think you'll have plenty to talk about together. Anyway, in this group, an amazing knowledge of tax policy, of the drivers of inequality, of what we really need to be paying attention to, both in this summit and in the next few days. So I'm going to stop now and turn it over, and thank you all.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ida. And we'll try to be very relaxed and informal here, as you will be over the next few days. And let me just start by mentioning again how important the themes that you're all going to be looking at are to the Institute. We actually decided at the Ideas Festival to devote the entire festival, or a thread of the entire festival, going over 10 days, to issues relating to inequality and opportunity. We commissioned special polls. We brought an extraordinary array of people here. And something else I probably should have mentioned is the Aspen Institute is a bipartisan, nonpartisan institution. And we were very pleased and not at all surprised that while the solutions to some of these challenges are often looked at in very partisan lenses, there was and is enormous agreement across the political spectrum about the urgencies of these problems, about the expanding gap between those of lower income and higher income, the stagnation of many middle income wages, and the implications for that. The conversations there were very robust, and people were looking for some solutions to the challenges that we all face. I think this panel is a great way to introduce some of the things you'll be talking about, because it's going to allow us to look at some of the levers, whether they're retirement savings, home ownership, tax incentives, or other public policy solutions to these challenges. So let me start with you, Senator Harkin, and let me mention also that Senator Harkin was one of our stalwart supporters and members of our congressional program, which is something that we've been operating for more than 30 years, where we bring members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats together into both meetings on the Hill, but also meetings around the world around critical issues. It's perhaps the only program of its kind that seems to pass every ethical test in terms of congressional boondoggles. This is anything but a boondoggle, but we are thrilled to have you involved in a program like this. The program was run for many years by his fellow Senator Dick Clark, and so it's great to bring you back into into another aspect of the Institute. So obviously one of the pillars of household wealth is retirement savings. And we were just talking outside during the cocktail hour about how people of our generations are in reasonably good shape. Most of us, many of us, certainly not all of us, but that those younger than us, after the period that we've seen with stagnation of wages and a hollowing out in many respects of the middle class, have a much harder challenge there. So let me just start by asking a basic question, whether you think Americans today are prepared for retirement.
Well, first of all, Elliot, thank you for inviting me out. As you said, I've been a participant in the Aspen Institute's week-long congressional seminars where we take a week and we go someplace and we focus on one subject, education, or a whole series of year after year on political Islam and different things like that. And someone once described that week as an intellectual spa for members of Congress. No staff, no press, all off the record, and all just academics. The presenters were just all learned academics. And then every Thursday morning we have a breakfast in a Senate room down there for both House and Senate members every Thursday morning. And they're just wonderful. Again, no press, no staff, just members, and someone makes a presentation on a subject. And they are some of the best discussions I've ever heard. So I can see I've never been here before, but I can see this as sort of an intellectual spa also with your summer program. So thanks for inviting me, because I can't go to those congressional things anymore. So any discussion about the income or wealth disparity in America, and any discussion about focus and solutions, you have to put retirement security at the top of the list. I had a whole series of hearings on this when I was chairman, going over a few years. And I said at the time, or after all these hearings, I said, this is the most underreported crisis facing America. The most underreported crisis. As Elliot said, we're kind of on a bubble right now. Those of my generation, we had pensions, good Social Security, able to save some money, but that is about to end. That kind of bubble is just about to end. The next wave of retirees have no pensions, absolutely zero savings, or little savings, and an inadequate Social Security. The only thing that's sure is Social Security, and it's inadequate. Let me just go over some of the dimensions of the crisis. When I came to Congress 40 years ago, 1 out of every 2 Americans had a pension. That means they had a lifetime stream of income until the day they died with survivor benefits. 1 out of every 2. Today it's 1 out of 5 and getting worse. Every year we're losing more and more. 75 million American workers have no retirement plan whatsoever. 0. One of the primary causes of the crisis is that only 1/2 of private sector workers have access to a retirement plan through their employer. Only 1/2. Think small businesses. Not just them, but think about that. Further dimensions, savings. The Employee Benefit Research Institute, their data said that 1/2 of Americans have less than $10,000 in savings. 1/2, less than 10,000. And there's a racial and gender gap. For those with a retirement plan, remember I said only half of all workers have a retirement plan? Of those, Black and Latino account balances are 1/5 of white account balances. And gender, we all know about the income gap between women and men in the working years, but after you retire, it becomes even more pronounced. 2011 figures, median income of women after the retirement years is $14,225 a year. Median income for men was $24,794 per year. And someone pointed out, well, savings rate among women are higher than men, and that's true. But women are concentrated in jobs that don't offer a retirement plan. And because of the unequal pay during their working years, whatever they do have in retirement is less, and less than Social Security too, by the way. So women get a double whammy. They get less when they're working, and then when they retire and get Social Security, they get less than Social Security. So that's sort of the dimensions of the problem. And it's hanging over us. And I see Josh Gottman, who used to be with the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. He's been my witness a lot of times. And the PBGC can't handle, if these central states and others go belly up, they won't be able to handle it. We're going to have a whole bunch of people out there that think they have a retirement now who won't have anything, or they'll have maybe well, Josh could help me on this, 10% maybe, 20, I don't know what it would be, of what they think they're going to get when they retire. So it is a big issue that's not being reported. Now, I don't know if you want to go through solutions or not, but there's just a couple. One, we need a new retirement system in America that's broadly based, that covers all workers, that has some features of a 401k, but more features of a DB, a defined benefit plan, which provides for a lifetime stream of income after you retire. So we need to do that. We also need to strengthen Social Security. We've got to have an alternative view of Social Security. And I think it's happening bit by bit. We went through a period of, we got to raise retirement age, we got to cut benefits and all that. But I took an opposite view. Social Security is not really in that big of a problem. It really isn't. With fewer minor turns and manipulations, you can make Social Security stronger and better by raising the bend point. You can provide more, a better benefit for lower income people over a longer period of time. You can have the CPI for COLA based on CPIE, which is elderly CPI, which gives a truer picture of what the elderly spend their money on. And of course, people say, well, how are you going to pay for all that? Well, raise the cap. I've suggested raising the cap from it's now to $113,000. Over 5 years, lift the cap and let it go. By the way, doing those three things would give a better benefit to lower income people. It would give a truer COLA every year, probably a little bit more, and raise the cap. That would extend the 100% fund, 100% viability of Social Security to pay out 100% of benefits to 2049. It's now 2033. That would extend it out to 2049. And then we need a new retirement system, which I hope we'll get into. We'll talk about that I looked at. We had a lot of hearings on this. We looked at basically 3 different countries and took some from Australia, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, and what they're doing with their retirement system to provide for what I call a universal, secure, adaptable retirement system. It's not a 401k. And I know I have a lot of people from the investment community here. God bless 401ks. I have no argument against them if you look upon them as a savings program. But 401ks were never meant to be a retirement program. Savings is fine. There's a lot of leakage. People take money out for housing. They take it out for education. They take it out in a lump sum when they retire because, my God, I got $150,000 in my 401k. And you know, my Uncle Fred, he knows how to make a lot of money on investments. If I just take that money and do what Uncle Fred says, I'm going to make more money. By the way, the house needs a new roof. I could use a new car too. You get my drift, right? That $150,000 or $200,000 is gone. So 401ks, fine for savings, but we need a retirement system to replace the old DB system that we had in this country. And that's all I got to say.
No, well, I'm just going to ask you a little bit more, though, and we're going to open this up at some point, too, after I have a short conversation with each of our panelists. Did the research you described there, was that the basis of the bill, the USA Retirement Funds Act that you introduced?
Exactly.
So,
yes.
And so where do you think that may go now? I mean,
well,
you're not there. I mean,
Well, I didn't get an interview until after I was about ready to leave because we had hearings. We had hearings over several years on this, and trying to get the support of the different investment communities that are out there. I think people here from Tia Kreft, they've been very involved in this, and Prudential, and Out My Way. So anyway, we tried to figure something out that would not really upset the apple cart too much in going forward, but something that would be easy to administer, which would cost less than a 401k, and relieve the burden from employers of having a fiduciary responsibility. That's one of the big problems. You get a DB plan, the economy tanks a little bit, you're in real trouble if you're a small business. So that's why small businesses they can't do a defined benefit program. They just can't. So you have to have something. So that's, when I introduced the bill, it was modeled after our hearings, looking, as I said, what we took a little bit from these other 3 countries, what they were doing, and put this together.
Well, let's just talk a little bit more about the politics of this now. As I mentioned during the Ideas Festival, we commissioned a poll on many issues, but one of the fascinating things, not surprising things we saw, was just how anxious Americans are about retirement.
Oh, yeah.
And how anxious Americans of your age, my age, are about what things are going to be like for our children. And you know, potentially the first generation that is going to not have the living standards that the one that preceded them. Given the urgency of this, given the fact that Americans are so worried about it, are we going to hear about these issues in the next year in the political campaigns or not?
Well, I sure hope so. I hope, I hear both sides now, both Republicans and Democrats running for president, talking about income inequality, wealth income inequality as the issue of our time. Well, that's yes, I think it is, and I think it has to be addressed, and others will address different factors of it. But I want to make sure that retirement security is a big part of that discussion and debate. It is, again, some of the data that we have accumulated through our hearings. There was one figure we got to remember, only 14% of working Americans feel that they are going to be secure in their retirement. When we broke it down a little bit more, that 14%, it was basically among union households that had a DB plan or state and local government employees that had a pension plan. When you got out of that and into the private sector, it dropped down into less than 5% of people in the private sector felt that they had enough to retire on, that they were going to have enough to retire on. So I don't know, the political dimensions, I'm going to do my darndest in Iowa to try to get this up as an issue for debate and discussion. It should be, and I hope that when all these candidates, and I don't draw a dividing line here, I mean all of them, both sides of the aisle, start talking about this, someone should say, what about retirement security? What are you going to do about that? And I hope Social Security is a part of that. Mm-hmm. I think we've been led a little astray on the so-called problems of Social Security. I separate out the problems of Medicare. That's a different issue. I'm talking about Social Security. I think we've been led a little astray on quote problems in Social Security. There's not that many problems in Social Security in terms of the retirement payment that goes out.
Sarah Wartell, one of the pillars of household wealth is obviously retirement savings. Another is housing. And recent research from the Urban Institute shows that the home ownership rate in the United States, which of course fell tremendously during the Great Recession, is going to continue to erode perhaps for another dozen or 15 years. Given that research and that continued decline, what role will housing play here? I mean, it's traditionally been a linchpin of securing the American dream and a secure retirement. How is that changing now?
Well, and housing is an important part of savings for retirement as well. It's the one other way in which people are able to, have been traditionally middle-class families, have been able to have a kind of a forced savings mechanism outside of pensions and retirement savings to build up assets that they can then downsize and rely on for their later years. And the challenges with housing that we're going to talk about, in fact, also are deeply connected to the issues the senator's just raising. So for many Americans, and remember, we're a growing country, there are going to be more people who will be relying on their homes for their savings than there have ever been. We estimate that by the year 2030, there will be an additional 9 million more households owning a home than we have today over the next, between 2010 and 2030. So there will be more homeowners, but there will be a lot more renters. There'll be 12 million additional renters. And the result of that is probably, our projections are, and these are only, models aren't truth, they're smart guesses. The projections are that we will see our home ownership rate, which was in 2010 65.1 and has fallen now in the aftermath of recession. We're guessing that it'll be something like 61.3, so down almost 4 full points between 2010 and 2030. Now what's going to happen there? Couple things. First, millennials are choosing not necessarily to become homeowners, or certainly not to become homeowners as early. They saw what happened. They're wanting to live in places where there are different kinds of housing stock. Lots of people are making choices. How much of that little distance from the recession may change, we're not clear, but our sense is there's something structural. Bigger issue structurally is also family formation is later. We find that people are forming households, typically marriage, but other kinds of committed households, later, and they're delaying child rearing. How much of that is recession and we will go back to normal patterns? We can't be sure, but the signals are that that is probably a structural change. In other words, people will have, we have more and more single adults with or without children, in many cases with children, but without a second adult in the household. That makes that prospect of homeownership much less likely. Third is demographics, and this is also important. The proportion of our population, the new households, are going to be overwhelmingly Hispanic. Growth in a lot of minority populations, but overwhelmingly Hispanic. And those Hispanic and African American homeowners have traditionally achieved homeownership later and at far lower rates. And we're projecting that based on lots of good estimates, that Hispanics' rates of homeownership acquisition will continue to rise as it's been rising from 40 to about 44. I'm sorry, those numbers aren't quite. Let me get it'll go from about 40 to, from 47 to 48%. But we're estimating that African American homeownership rates are going to fall. And this is a hugely important issue I want to come back to. Probably going to fall from 44%, where they were at the beginning of the recession, to 42, where we are, we expect by 2030 to 40. So a huge loss in opportunity to acquire savings and a security blanket for the families. The last thing I'll just say is the way housing will affect economic opportunity for people is that not only will we have fewer people in homeowners, but we will have a lot more renters. And we're going to have a lot of demand for rental housing. But to produce a new unit of rental housing in most of our cities where that demand is going to be costs more than those incomes can support. So we should be producing right now at this stage in the coming twice the number of net new units that we're producing, twice. And so what that means is supply constraints, and when you have supply constraints, rents continue to rise. So people who are not homeowners are going to be spending a higher and higher percentage of their income on their housing, and when they do that, less money available, discretionary money available for setting aside, for doing their own savings, for investing in their kids' education, all the other things.
You've talked a little bit about demographics. The Urban Institute and others have also done a great deal of research on the link between neighborhoods and inequality, and just how much where you live matters. Matter of fact, in this room, I interviewed last week or 10 days or so ago Bob Putnam, who's written an extraordinary new book, The American Dream in Crisis, where he depicts, it shows exactly how zip codes tragically really determine the life opportunities of young Americans. It's an extraordinary book. But what have you learned about the role of place in fostering or limiting economic opportunity?
So for a long time in the community development field, there was a battle, and the battle was between the folks who believed that you can, within the four walls of a poor community, You're going to bring everything they need to create the kind of place where families can be successful. And you know, you could go back to the settlement house movement, to bringing social services into places and trying to smother the neighborhoods that were the least resource communities with additional resources. And then in the 1980s and others, people started talking about moving to opportunity, this idea that in fact we had to take children out of their homes, their parents out of their homes, and move them into places where there was more access, there was more diversity, there was more access to economic opportunity, there was better transit, better schools. And there was a lot of pushback and resistance to that, as you can imagine, from people not wanting those people to come into my communities. And some of the early research on the moving to opportunity studies told us, well, in fact, the incomes of those families didn't see a noticeable boost. And that was discouraging, and there was a lot of talk about why was that, and maybe the studies weren't designed quite right. So we saw mental health gains for the families, but not economic outcomes. Well, more recent work by Raj Chetty and some of his colleagues at Harvard have started to have demonstrated that, in fact, there are significant economic gains, but those gains come to the kids. Children who grow up in neighborhoods, as Putnam then beautifully describes the many in much more kind of less numeric and more human ways, the ways that communities of opportunity provide support and opportunity for children to make gains over where their parents were, and the ways, most importantly, that these very toxic communities with the paucity of resources destroy. So go back to that debate I described. Is this a place-based strategy where we put everything in, or a moving to opportunity strategy? We can't do only one of those, because we're not going to move all of our children into Scarsdale, and we are not going to be able to put all of all the things that communities need in the four walls of community. And my colleague Marge Turner has coined a phrase we're very proud of, which is called place-conscious strategies. How do you begin to connect people wherever they are, create opportunities for them to move, but also in the places they are, whether it's through transit, through technology, to have them be able to connect to the resources and the things they need. Chetty told us that neighborhoods of opportunity have low economic segregation, so mixed income communities where there is less inequality among the neighborhoods. And we just did a study about the differences between places that have a lot of, that are unequal within the community versus places that have a lot of diversity within them. And the places that have more extreme and less middle, people do less well there. Economic and racial segregation, more general inequality, schools, huge driver, civic and social infrastructure, and the share of two-parent families are the things that seem to correlate most strongly in Chetty's research with communities of opportunity. Correlate. What are the causations? What are the ways that we can influence those? That's the next.
Well, a different kind of question. Financial services obviously can help families build wealth through a variety of assets that can be developed. But many argue that financial services really only do an effective job for upper income Americans. I wonder if you agree with that, and whether there are any opportunities or what could be done to make simple, affordable services available to a broader array of American families.
So here's a place where I have a bit more hope, and a couple things. I do think that our public policy creates an environment in which there's a lot of incentives for participating in financial services, particularly different types of savings vehicles that are heavily tax favor those at the top end, and I suspect Lily will have more to say about that. But I think that sort of general market-based policies, it's expensive. There's a lot of transaction costs in serving small dollar clients. And so the financial services sector hasn't done as well as we all would have hoped in serving low and moderate income people. Countries that didn't have the banking systems that we had and kind of leapfrogged us and brought in mobile technologies and other things to build their payment systems, as lots of people in this room know better than I, actually have shown us some things about how we can serve some of those populations better. And so I am hopeful that being able to take advantage of technology to drive down those kinds of costs. And there's very exciting stuff happening through the Financial Diaries Project and Center for Financial Services Innovation. I think someone here is from there. They're doing cool things that make us suggest that it may be possible, but I think supportive public policies can make a difference in that too.
Okay, Lily, let's turn, not surprisingly, to tax policy and other kinds of public policy. For example, insurance-related policy relating to the Affordable Care Act, which you were involved in. Tell us a little bit about the role of the tax code, how it has either contributed to the dilemma and the challenge we are in today, or some of the things that can be done as solutions.
Sure. I mean, I think it has been a major factor. Tax is sort of an expression of our values. It's also one of the determinants of how we distribute resources in society. And so if we think of the problem as sort of increasing wealth creation, especially at the low and middle end, we've seen both, while we've seen this rise of income inequality, also a rise of wealth inequality. And wealth inequality has always been much more dramatic even than income inequality. And the tax code, I think, has contributed to this in a number of ways.
Contributed to the wealth inequality.
Yes, to both of them, really. So the first factor is just that, in general, wealth inequality is correlated with income inequality, because the more unequal incomes are, the more affluent people have to save, and affluent people tend to save more in the first place as a share of their income. And this has sort of a snowball effect where then once they're saving more, they have more capital income, and so the wealth inequality then drives more income inequality as well. And the tax code generally has become less progressive over time, so that has been contributing to both those factors. It actually has been doing more at the low end with programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, but overall revenues as a share of GDP have been declining. And you've also seen a decline in the tax rates at the very top. So
A dramatic one.
Yes. So, relative to the 70s, they were in 70% or something. There were a lot of tax shelters at that time, so the effective rates weren't quite as high. But still, if you look at the effective rates of the top 1%.
Even the effective rates were much, much higher.
Yeah, the effective rates were, something like 40, 45% for the top 1%. They're now 30. The other issue is the tax code contributes to how easy it is for people to save. And as Sarah alluded to, we have these upside down retirement savings incentives and other incentives like the mortgage interest deduction, which make it easier and provide more support for more affluent people to save.
So what kinds of things do you think could be done that would affect a more shared prosperity, just looking at the tax code?
I think there's several things, and I would actually refer to a lot of things in the president's budget this year. There were both some continuing proposals and a number of new proposals. So maybe starting at the very top end, you can start bringing those effective tax rates higher for the very wealthiest. And so some of the proposals in there were to raise the capital gains rate back to 28%, what it was under President Reagan, to repeal something called stepped-up basis, which basically eliminates the capital gains tax on assets that are held until death. Those two proposals, I think about 99% of the revenue is raised from the top 1%, and 80% is raised from the top 0.1%, which has really been driving that wealth inequality gap. You can also work on making the tax incentives less upside down and less geared towards the high end, and do that both by shaving down a little bit what they are at the high end. So for a number of years, the president's proposed limiting tax expenditures, limiting the value to 28%. But then also try to focus them better on the low end, whether it's through something like auto IRA and making sure that we're getting more people access to retirement savings vehicles. And then I think there are a number of things you can do to address the income inequality at the low end that aren't necessarily directly about savings but contribute. So things like the ARA credits, the expansions to the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, the American Opportunity Tax Credit. There are some big new proposals on child care in this year's budget, which is actually the single biggest expense, even more than housing in a lot of areas for families.
And finally, what about the various policies, including the Affordable Care Act, that are addressed to the short-term crises and challenges that make such a difference in families' ability to save? I mean, where do you think the administration has been successful, and what are some of the other things that you think could be done that would address that element of the problem?
I'm glad you asked that, because I feel like we often sort of focus on how much people are saving for retirement.
Savings, but I mean, you can save very effectively for a long
Yeah.
time, but then face
And
medical
have a
bills
crisis.
or other
Yeah.
kind of crises, and it's all
Yeah.
to naught.
And if you actually go back to some of Elizabeth Warren's original academic work, it was all about how these healthcare crises are a huge driver of families going into bankruptcy. So, obviously the Affordable Care Act is a major force in addressing that. I think so far it's resulted in about 16 more people having health insurance coverage. There is still more to be done even under that. So, for example, if the remaining roughly 21 states that haven't taken up the Medicaid expansion did, you'd have another roughly 5 million families being covered. Childcare is another issue that you could have childcare crises, you can have elder care crises where a parent gets sick and you need to take care of them, and having more support for that might really help families weather those shocks. And then I would go back to things like the expansion of the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit that have been shown to really improve health outcomes, education outcomes, lifetime earnings of the kids that grow up and benefit from them.
One just last question. I'll just ask Sarah and Lily, and then open it up. I asked Senator about this, and that is the election coming up. And how do you see these issues playing out, if at all, given the priorities that seem to be assigned by the candidates in both parties? Are we going to have a healthy, robust debate about these issues, or are they going to be well down the list of those that get attention?
I think it's hard to tell so far. I mean, obviously it's early on, so some of the candidates have put out.
Hillary Clinton gave a talk just
she
a few
did,
days ago.
Yeah, and she talked about the Buffett rule and carried interest and paid leave and child care. Jeb Bush has said virtually nothing on taxes, so it remains to be seen. Marco Rubio has not a full tax reform plan, but a pretty well fleshed out one that loses a remarkable amount of revenue, probably at least $2.5 trillion. So, I think it'll depend on who the final candidates are and then whether they decide to get into that, at least in the tax area, the tax debate. It does seem like on the Republican side, they're being a bit more cautious given some of the attacks on Mitt Romney about committing to things that might get them in hot water later.
Susan, what do you see in terms of what the debate will be, and what would you like it to be?
Well, so on the what it will be, I think there's going to be what we've seen in the past. There will be very grand and broad stroke rhetoric, and then policies which will be much more targeted and micro. And I think, so the interesting thing to first look at is what issues is the rhetoric embracing? Economic mobility, everybody should have a chance to have their kids do better. That's a theme that is completely bipartisan, all ends of the political spectrum. What's been interesting is that, and you hear that all the time. I don't think we get more attention now, but I don't think it's unique. Economic inequality is not something, because when you start to talk about inequality, people assume your next thing is going to be about redistribution. And so politicians have generally been very uncomfortable talking about inequality. And that's why I think it's quite remarkable that you do have Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio expressly talking not just about mobility, but actually
And you have
talking about inequality.
Charles Murray as well as Bob Putnam talking about it.
But there are some of the candidates on the Republican side who are not there, and in fact Walker has been kind of a little bit uncomfortable even in the mobility conversation. So there's a very interesting, I think, finding itself going on in the Republican Party, which is maybe a reason to be hopeful that there'll be some rethinking of solutions. I do think after you talk about inequality, when you go back to what the policies are, they're all in the mobility space. Nobody is actually talking about things that are designed to, except for maybe some of the carried interest things really aimed at moving the middle. People want to kind of bring the bottom up a little bit, and it's mostly in terms of creating opportunities for you to become a more effective. So you're going to go back to workforce development and the other things. So I would like to be optimistic that I see a path forward to tackle some of the retirement savings issues that the senator has framed, and I would love to be proven wrong by this, but I don't see a lot of signals that at least this cycle we will see. I think we're going to have a set of themes that could then be built upon in a presidency to return us back to some of the savings issues. But I think right now we're going to be talking about workforce development, and we're going to be talking about skills and jobs and the kind of things about helping other people get into the mainstream economy. I think that's too bad, but probably.
So the talk will be more about opportunity than inequality.
If you look at, I actually read Hillary's speech on my way here, and although there are some passing comments about inequality in the framing, it's always in the same sentence. It's people, the problems of economic mobility and the problems of inequality are in fact economically very different issues, and yet it's like a single expression. We have these, stagnating wages, growing inequality, and loss of economic mobility. It's like it's a phrase that people don't even discern what they're saying. It's just that set of things, the problems we're worried about. And when you go to disentangle them, people are very uncomfortable in the inequality space.
Senator Harkin, did you have something you wanted to add? And then
Well, I just on this tax issue going into the presidential election. It's going to be a very simple debate. They want to raise your taxes, or she or he wants to raise your taxes, and I don't. I'm not going to raise taxes. And that's just how it's going to kind of come out. So I think into that debate, I would hope that, at least maybe I'm speaking politically here, at least I hope some will start saying, well, wait a minute. If we continue the present system of taxes that we have, it is grossly unfair. So we're not really talking about raising taxes, we're talking about making the system more fair. And that means that maybe some of the people on the top who are really not paying their fair share need to pay a little bit more. And I think polls show that most Americans feel that people at the very high level of income spectrum really are not maybe paying their fair share of taxes. So that somehow that debate's got to be moved to an issue of fairness, not whether I'm going to raise your taxes and that person's not going to raise your taxes.
Quite enough revenue up there, right?
Pardon?
There's just not quite enough revenue at the very, very tippy top to be able to deal with some of the questions.
No, not so much just among people,
there is a lot
but
there.
among
Let's go to the audience if
among
we
the
can.
business transactions.
And if you can wait for the microphone right here at the first table.
For example, like carried interest rule.
Hi,
It's on.
I'm Josh Barrow with the New York Times. On the subject of tax-preferred savings programs having their benefits weighted toward the wealthy, one of the proposals in President Obama's budget this year was to curtail tax benefits for future deposits to 529 savings plans. And this was not one of the more popular proposals in the president's budget. I believe it survived less than a week.
30 seconds.
Particularly for Lily, but for all of you, I'm wondering what lessons you take from that politically in terms of the White House made what I thought was a pretty good case that 529 plans mostly benefit people who range from affluent to very wealthy. The Obamas themselves, in a year when they made over $2 million, made very large 529 contributions on behalf of their daughters. 529s probably do very little to affect the percentage of Americans who go to college. And yet, people hated this idea. Not just Republicans, Democrats hated this idea. If you can't touch that, how do you change any of these issues around the weighting of these tax benefits?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, first I would say, I think there was bound to be something that was picked on in this year's budget, because it was basically the first one where, rather than saying that every single individual under 200, 250 had to be held harmless, that in aggregate each income group was going to be made better off under the budget, but there would be individuals under 200, 250 that were not held harmless. So that was, a bold move, and there are a number of things. If it wasn't 529s, it could have been that we got rid of the student loan interest deduction, or that we got rid of child care flexible savings accounts, or there's a lot of things that were controversial, that were part of reform proposals that overall were shifting the benefits of tax incentives to low and moderate income people. But there are particular people, making $150,000. Those happen to be a lot of people in the Beltway, a lot of reporters, maybe taking advantage of these particular incentives. I think a smaller lesson was, I believe that was the only proposal that had not actually been proposed by a Republican. So FSAs, a lot of the other controversial stuff you could find at least in the camp plan or something. So that might have been another reason why that one was picked off. A third is it has a very powerful, defined lobbying group that was very quickly organized. If you were to try to rejigger all retirement savings, there are some very powerful groups as well, but there may not be only one of them. And so I think that had a particular salience. I think another lesson from it is just even if you're trying to make sure that more people can go to college and target benefits on people that are least likely to go to college and simplify, that something that sounds as good as a tax subsidy for saving for your kids for college is going to be a tough road to hoe.
Yes.
I think this is a slightly more general question, but everything that's been talked about. Sorry, I'm David Blitzer from New York, or from S&P Dow Jones Indices, so from the financial industry, better or worse. But a lot of the suggestions are part of the answer, part of what's going to have to do part of the effort is clearly the government. People move around all the time from job to job, so their retirement solution, whatever it is, it can't be 100% their employer, because they keep changing their employer. Same thing, people move around from city to city, so if they're going to buy a house, they're going to have to keep selling it for more and more, if that's going to be saving. The government has to play a role. But yet, compared to what I remember 20, 30 years ago, everybody hates the government. Nobody thinks it can do any good. To get anywhere, I think we've got to begin to change that attitude a little bit. At least convince the government's not the total enemy. But I'm not quite sure how we do that, and so on. But we're not going to do it without the government, for better or for worse.
Just make an observation about that. I mean, think about the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, right, as proof positive, how it's working today versus how it was working, but the lessons people have learned from that. In the housing finance space that I work in, Mary knows this very well, the housing GSEs, people were talking about, which are essentially given a huge backup from the federal government. We're talking about trying to move them a little closer to the private sector. And the complexity of that, everyone argued, that sounds more like healthcare reform. They'd rather keep the GSEs essentially as wards of the public state than they would try to do something that they so distrusted government to find a solution that the inadequate situation of the current status quo was more desirable for many people. So I think you're exactly on to something. And the more things sound like a solution that is largely private market driven or individually driven, that's why I think people on both sides like the EITC, the more likely a solution is going to be, I mean, the EITC is probably the single federal government policy in our last couple decades that have touched more people's lives, particularly the people who we're talking about here today who have most need of it. And what is it? This is how we're doing more and more of our policies through the tax code, precisely because there's no government agency. Many tax expenditures are quite inefficient, but people believe, and in some cases they are, more efficient relative to having an apparatus inside a federal agency and a lot of bureaucracies. Some cases that's not true. The government would actually do it better. And in some cases it is true. But either way, the public just can't bear the idea of another program.
Another thing I would add to that is I think there's a spectrum of ways that government can be involved. So, if you're talking about portability of retirement savings, there's, on one hand, we could expand Social Security. On another hand, we could do something like Senator Harkin's proposed, where you're keeping the 401k infrastructure, you're adding these USA funds, they're, I believe, going to be run by the private sector. And then you can move towards the auto IRA proposal that maybe has even more investment choice. But there's a spectrum of ways that you can expand universal savings programs for retirement that involve the government, but may or may not have the same set off the same alarm bells politically on various sides of the aisle.
I don't want more government agencies, but I don't want people to reject the idea that the government is totally useless. Some places may be a happy medium. And right now, I see too many rejectionists, and it's sort of shutting up the rest of the people who say maybe you ought to think about it.
Well, many of you have been traveling a long way, so we're not going to continue this long. You can continue the conversation over dinner as well. But there are two hands over there, and if you could each just give your question, and then we'll use those as an opportunity for the panel to make some last comments before we all move down to dinner.
Okay, great. Matt Fellows at Hello Wallet and Morningstar. A couple questions for Sarah. The first is, the projections that you shared with us, really interesting about the future of home ownership rates. I wonder if you could comment on why you think those home ownership rates are going to be declining. Are those preferences? Are those policy changes, the demographic changes? What do you think is going to be driving that? The second, which I hope you won't feel is heretical, being a housing expert, but I wonder if you think we should be striving to reverse those home ownership rate projections. In other words, whether we should be continuing to invest behind efforts to encourage home ownership. And I ask because tenure rates have declined quite a bit over the last 40 or 50 years, making it harder for households to accumulate wealth from home ownership. There's also research, I think one of your colleagues at Urban did some of this research that found that in particular minority households have trouble accumulating wealth from housing relative to other types of investments. So I just wonder if you think it might be time to reevaluate housing as an asset accumulation vehicle and think instead about maybe some other savings vehicles that might be more efficient.
Okay, we definitely have a last question for you, Sarah, and then
I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Senator Harkin for the amazing work that he did. I wanted to thank Senator Harkin for the amazing work that he did. I'm Deborah Whitman from ARP. I wanted to thank Senator Harkin for the amazing work that he did on so many of the issues we're talking about here at this conference, and particularly pushing retirement saving to the forefront. And ask him if there's any hope, given the movement in so many states, many of whom are represented here, to actually solve the solution that their constituents want.
I still can't, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Is there any hope for states to do what?
For this, the state retirement, states are setting up retirement programs. Is there any hope?
State-based retirement funds?
Yeah, is there any hope at the federal level for retirement savings to be taken on as an issue by members of Congress?
Well, you had the first question.
It's okay. If you want, why don't you take this one, then we'll close back. So.
Well, I don't know that I understood. I think the question had to do with what about states that are running their retirement systems, things like that. Well, yeah, if you're California, which is another country in itself, I mean, it's so big. Well, I don't mean that as a denigrating state. I mean, it's just so big. And we have someone here, I noticed, that runs that system. Yeah, but that's such a unique situation with California. And maybe a couple of other states, but you get beyond that, and states just don't have the wherewithal to do that. Plus the fact, as someone said, people are so mobile. They're moving all over the place all the time. And you need a system that is portable from one state to the other. I'm not certain that CalPERS is very portable. It's okay if you're in California, but if you move to Iowa or Nebraska, I don't think CalPERS would cover you, I don't think. So I'm saying, some states could do some things on their own, there's no doubt about it, but that will not suffice for a national system. And I think under the proposal that we had come up with, states can also sort of fold into that kind of a system too, with a defined benefit type of a program that they have in their state and local government entities in those states.
and Sarah.
So Matt, why are we projecting these differences? It's all of the above. First and foremost, personal choice. People who've learned some of the lessons you've talked about, and people are making different decisions. Choice about their housing. It's also the fact that their wages are making it harder and harder for people to save enough for homeownership. It's choices about their family formation. And it's the demographic change and the fact that more of the population is increasingly being in parts of society where there's lower educational attainment, and unless we accelerate dramatically the rate at which we close some other aspects of disparities in our society as our composition of our population changes, we're going to see lower wealth as an average across our society. And I think that the extent of those disparities is a really big problem. Should housing be the solution to that? Ideally, the answer, if we were all looking at a whiteboard, no way we would say that the best way people should save. I mean, having a way that forces people to save, that's a good idea. And to some extent, if you were to find a way to encourage savings and accumulation of assets and doing it through the tax code, that's not a bad idea. But you would do it in a progressive mechanism. You wouldn't do it through real estate. You wouldn't do it through a volatile asset. And an asset that in many cases value changes based on dynamics like whether the local factory closes or not, that's outside of your control. So should we say housing shouldn't be our vehicle? We should abandon any goals around homeownership? Homeownership is going to fall no matter what we do, I think, for the reasons I was describing. And that we should be okay with the rate falling, but we should not be okay that people who want to be homeowners, and in a society where the biggest single tax subsidy we give is for this, that whole parts of our society don't have access to that. We shouldn't be okay that the credit box is so tight that our rates of African American homeownership are going to fall 4% over 20 years. We absolutely can't be okay with that. So, whiteboard, would we make housing our primary savings vehicle? Absolutely not. But in this environment that we're in, expanding access to homeownership is not about getting the homeownership rate back up to 67%. We're never going back there, in my lifetime, certainly. It's simply about ensuring that there's equitable access to the existing mechanisms that are available.
Final comments.
Just one last follow-up on retirement savings. I believe data shows that pooled retirement savings invested has a huge multiplier effect in the economy. I think bigger than just about anything else. And why is that? Because I think the term they use is quiet capital. You see, pooled retirement funds can be invested without thinking about the next quarter or the quarter after that. They can think about long-term investments. That's why pooled retirement savings can be used for startup companies that may not be able to get paid back right away, but over a long period of time they could. I see it also as a mechanism for the entire infrastructure rebuilding of America, which is going to require huge amounts of investment, but for a long period of time. And so these retirement funds they have a huge multiplier effect in terms of creating jobs in the economy, not the least of which is construction, housing, apartments, and things like that. Again, that may not give you the next quarter return that you need, but over 10 or 15 years give you a nice return on that investment. So that's why I harp on retirement, pooled retirement savings. Can be a great vehicle for getting us out of the economic doldrums that we're in the United States right now.
Well, I'd like to thank our panel very much and welcome all of you. Ida's dinner going to be downstairs?
Dinner is going to be right downstairs from here in just a few minutes, so we can mingle a little bit here and we'll just give a signal.
And conversation can continue. Thank you very much.